Hello, and thank you for joining us. On the 16th of August 2012, the South African Police Services massacred 34 striking miners in Marikana, South Africa, who were working at a mine owned by Lonmin, a British mining company. Today, we will be speaking with Dr. Andy Higginbottom about the Marikana Massacre and the local organizing and international solidarity efforts that have emerged since then around the issue. Dr. Higginbottom is an associate professor in the Department of Politics, Human Rights, and International Rights at Kingston University in London, where he teaches and researches on international political economy, slavery, emancipation, and extractivism. He has also been a longtime international solidarity campaigner in active support of social movements in South Africa, Colombia, the Elam Tamils, and anti-colonial and liberation movements around the world. Andy, thank you very much for speaking with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
So first, can you give us more of an overview about the Marikana Massacre, both the events of that day, as well as the background leading up to it and the global dimensions involved?
Sure. I mean, what happened on the 16th of August 2012 was a massacre filmed by the TV cameras of the world. There are a lot of journalists there, and the mine workers had been on strike for about 2 weeks at that point. And there are three big platinum mining companies, and Lonmin was the lowest payer. And the workers had been on strike for what they considered to be a living wage, which was 12,500 Rand a month. Now, there was a lot of investigation about how much money the mine workers were actually getting, how much the corporation could afford. I mean, most of the information is that the mine workers were getting a take-home pay of about 5,000 Rand a month, which is about £250 or a bit more. And so they were really asking for a huge increase, because basically they couldn't survive on the money they were getting. They wanted a living wage. And Marikana, if you ever see pictures or if you have the opportunity to go and see it, you'll see it's just a dirt camp. I mean, there are some shacks, most of the town around the mine are shacks. There are some dedicated sort of hostel type housing, but still very small. And so the mine workers, many of them were indebted in actual fact. And furthermore, many of them have in effect two lives, because they're migrant workers. Most of them come from the Eastern Cape, which is another part of South Africa, about 800 kilometers away. And their family homes are there, but they have to live and work away for about 11 months a year. And many of them in effect have a second home. I mean, impoverished, but nonetheless, the expenditure that is there, they have to spend money home and they have to spend money where they are. And so they were really desperate. Now, the mining industry in South Africa is hugely important. There are about 400,000 mine workers. The platinum sector has grown a lot in the last 25 years or so, and it's overtaken the gold mining sector as being the biggest employer, but it's highly concentrated, only three big companies, as I've said. Most of the ownership is of what's known as white monopoly capital, which is actually not only white, it's actually mostly British. So you have a lot of profits from the mining sector end up in London and elsewhere. So Lonmin is the corporation concerned. They refused to negotiate with the mine workers, and at the same time they were massively lobbying through the ANC government for the police to take action against the mine workers. Now, the key links in this chain, there are three main parties involved in the repression of the mine workers. The first is the corporation, the second is the ANC government and party apparatus, and the third were the police. And they all collaborated very closely. A huge amount of evidence has come out about how closely they collaborated. And there are two or three key personnel linking up this chain. One of the key people was a man who is now the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, who was already appointed to be on the board of directors. He was gifted a huge amount of money to take about a 9% shareholding in the company. And this is the so-called black empowerment. But really what it is, it's buying off a section of the African population to play exactly the role which actually Ramaphosa played in this hour of emergency with the company. And what they were buying, of course, was political influence. So Ramaphosa, as soon as the strike begins to develop, starts lobbying hard with the government to get the police to take action against the strikers. There's some forms of language which he later defends that he's not calling for police action against the strikers, but anybody reading it would understand that to be what he was asking for. So he's lobbying away, the company is lobbying away through him, and then the government, through the Minister of Police, Minister of Mines, starts telling the police that they have to end the strike. And it becomes incredibly clear that the police meet the day before the massacre, where they draw up a whole load of plans. They say in order to disarm the strikers had spears, they come from rural areas, they had big knives, panga type knives, and they had assegai, small spears. And they were using these. I mean, they were using these to try and make sure that they themselves were not attacked. They'd been shot at about 5 days before. And there becomes another sort of ingredient in the story, which is quite important to get the full picture, which is the mine workers had been represented by a union which was pro-ANC, NUM. And so the NUM had split loyalties, and there's a lot of people believe that the NUM had become too incorporated by the mining company in the structures, and therefore, rather than supporting the mine workers' strike, it was actually against the mine workers' strike. And this is documented quite fully, and it's actually been shown in an important film, which is Miners Shot Down, which shows how actually the NUM shot at the mine workers. So their fear of violent attack was quite reasonable. And in fact, about 4 days before this actual massacre, the police had attacked a group of mine workers. The mine workers on strike were going from one mine shaft to another, and they were effectively a mobile picket line. And they were demanding that anybody who was still working, and as some were, they were making very clear that they thought they should not be working. So there was a degree of pressure involved there, which is normal sort of activity of workers during a strike. But the actual real violence was against the strikers. And on this occasion, which again, it's not fully shown in the film, but the run up to it is shown in the film, the police were intimidating one of these flying pickets. And after the film cameras were stopped, they actually shot 3 of them. So the mine workers were very well aware that they could be attacked. They had experienced 2 attacks already. Now, how did they manage to organize and meet is also another part of the story, once it comes to a head on the 16th of August. They didn't really have a proper meet in place. The company wasn't giving them any facilities. Their union wasn't giving them any facilities. The municipality wasn't giving them any facilities. So they met in a sort of a barren place. It's completely dry and dusty area. It is completely sort of without infrastructure and support, except for human beings, except there's loads of electric cables and pylons bringing electricity to the mine. But anyway, they meet here on what's known as a small kopje, which is sort of like a small hillock full of boulders, big rocks. And the famous pictures of the mine workers perched like sort of birds waiting to fly, if you like, congregated there. I mean, thousands of them on this rocky hillock. And that's where they held their meetings and discussed what they were going to do. So on the 16th of August, that's exactly what they were doing. They had a leadership, maybe about a leadership group of about 25. They had their own internal processes of electing a leadership. And the leadership group was holding discussions with the mine workers when the police surrounded the place. And the police basically said, well, I didn't say anything, but their actions declared that they were closing the thing down. So they had these great big trucks, great big armored police vehicles, and they were laying barbed wire. And basically, as mine workers began to leave the area, because they could see that they were being closed in a circle and they wanted to get out, the leading group of miners was actually funneled by the police into a killing ground. The way the police did it is they had one long stretch of barbed wire, and then as the mine workers tried to get around this barbed wire, the police shot tear gas grenades behind this group, and the group splintered, but the main body of them kept on going forward, trying to get away from the tear gas. And as they went forward, unbeknownst to them, there was a line of police, over 50 of them, with assault rifles waiting to kill them. And as soon as this group of mine workers appeared, the police just opened fire. It's a fusillade. It was like a firing squad, and I mean, hundreds of assault rifles were going off. And you may well have seen the pictures, and most of the pictures will show there's one shot of one striking miner had a homemade pistol, and he did shoot this when the police started firing tear gas at the miners, and it was sort of like a response to the tear gas grenades. But I mean, you know, it was a completely unequal battle. So 17 miners were shot down as they were running towards a police line lined up in order to kill them. Now, the police maintained that they were there to disarm them. Absolutely no basis of that in what you can see happened, right? There was no attempt whatsoever to disarm them. Everything was set up in order to execute them. Now, this sort of intention becomes even clearer what happens immediately after that. So this huge barrage of shots goes off. Those behind the leading group start running away, and they run away to another area, which is a second small copy of rocks, and then they hide. They try to hide in bushes. As it happens, this second copy, as it's known, there's actually a public toilet. As I said, there's no facilities there. And when you're out in the open, well, how do you go to the toilet? Well, people go to a place where there's bushes and rocks, basically. So they're hiding away in the middle of shit, trying to get away from the police. And they're not in a group anymore. They're just hiding in ones and twos. The police come along and pick them off one by one. And many of them are shot in the back. Many of them are shot while they're trying to escape, hiding under small bushes and so on. 17 more miners get killed there. So there were 2 massacres on the 16th of August. Now, so much evidence has come out about the chain of command, the chain of communication. The night before, the police met and prepared everything. The day before, there's tapes of interviews between the head of human resources, who later turned out to be a government agent for Lonmin, and the commissioner of police discussing tomorrow is D-Day, tomorrow we will finish it. They don't say literally tomorrow we will kill them, but they say everything but that. So it's very clear that this was an intentional use of lethal weapons in order to kill the miners. What's really interesting is, despite this, the strike continued, and and they got some degree of wage settlement. But the massacre was immediately condemned. The ANC and its supporters don't use the term massacre. They talk about an incident or some such word like that. But it was a massacre, and it was a massacre under a democratically elected government. The ANC does have a majority support because of its role in the liberation struggle against apartheid. And so what you have is, under a democratically elected government, a massacre carrying out. And it was rightly, in my view, symbolically connected with the Soweto massacre in 1976, where hundreds of school students were killed by the apartheid police, and going back even further to the Sharpeville massacre in 1961, where again peaceful protesters were shot down by the police because they refused to carry a pass. Now, this really prompts major questions about how much has changed, despite the transition to majority rule and democratic elections, you know, of a character, of a type, but it's still much better than was before. I mean, the economic power of the corporation was such that it could get the government to do what it wanted them to do in order to attack striking mine workers. So that's pretty much what happened on the day.
Yeah, it's devastating. And so as you've described, there is this really global dimension to it. We have British corporations, the South African government. And in your view, how does this event, the Marikana Massacre, and the practices of the Lonmin Mining Company in South Africa relate or connect to struggles and other cases around the globe, struggles against imperialist and extractivist practices of Western states and mining corporations?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. There's a very strong historical connection, and there's a very strong sort of geographical extension of this. So if we take the historical aspect first, I mean, Lonmin was formed by Lonrho Corporation in the early 1970s. Now, Lonrho is named London Rhodesia Company, and it was set up in Bishopsgate in London in 1906. Now, Britain invaded what was then an independent land, not a nation state, but certainly an independent area of Africa in late 1890s. So within a decade of the occupation of what is today Zimbabwe, but became Rhodesia, within a decade of the occupation's settlement by force, by conquest of Rhodesia, the company Lonro was set up. And Lonro was set up in order to make profits out of the colonial occupation. And it was set up, named after Cecil Rhodes, the arch imperialist who had been sort of the main architect of British imperial expansion in Southern Africa, including taking over the mines. And certainly his intention before he died was to take over Rhodesia. So he has a country, actually has two countries named after him, Northern and Southern Rhodesia. So Lonro is more than the symbolic legacy of Rhodes, it's the actual economic legacy of Rhodes. So Lonro becomes a mining and cattle ranching farming company, commercial agriculture in Southern Rhodesia. And that lasts for about 50 years. I mean, it's sort of a middle ranking company, had shareholders in London getting their money from the colonial exploitation. But in the late 1960s, things change because of the wind of change in Africa and countries becoming newly independent. Now, the British had developed a neo-colonial strategy to deal with the transition to independence and to deal with how to keep making profits from countries that are nominally independent. And Lonro was absolutely key to this. Lonro became a strategic vehicle across almost the whole continent for a continuation of neo-colonial extraction. And the key figure here, second sort of persona, larger than life figure, was a guy called Tiny Rowland. And if Rhodes is completely symbolic of colonial conquest, then Rowland is completely symbolic of neo-colonial corruption. So what he did, he had a sort of a repertoire, a portfolio of things he did, right? He would befriend the leaders. He was very good at setting up joint venture companies, not with them personally, but with members of their immediate family, their cousins or their brothers-in-law, and what have you. And these were trading companies which used the government support to make huge profits. They would be doing things like controlling plantations, printing presses, importing cars, luxury goods. He would bring African leaders and their families over to shop in Harrods in London. He would make sure that their kids got sent to public schools in Britain. I mean, he was a complete architect of this neo-colonial collection. And Lonro catapulted from being a medium-sized colonial enterprise to being one of the biggest companies in Britain within a decade. And so this neo-colonial arrangement, I mean, it became as big as, sort of the huge food multinational like Brook Bonds and Unilever and companies like that. And so within a decade, he'd got a trick that worked. So Lonro then is portrayed as a friend of Black Africa because of all this connection with elite presidents and their families. But in actual fact, of course, this was just a commercial. I mean, it wasn't a love of the blackness of Africa, it was a love of the money that we gotten out of Africa. And so Lonro, despite Tiny Rowlands being presented as a friend of independent Africa, breaks sanctions and moves into South Africa under apartheid. And that's when it sets up Lonmin. So Lonmin, I mean, London Mining, I suppose. I mean, I've been told actually there's quite a few companies based on the name London Mining, which may not surprise you, because actually London is a worldwide centre of mining multinational corporations. So with the end of apartheid, we come to a third or fourth major chapter, because what happens is the big mining corporations in South Africa, led by Anglo-American, but the second and third biggest as well, in effect, all move their centre of operations out of Johannesburg to London. And they reposition themselves as being global mining corporations. And this is very important in terms of the role that Britain plays. There's been a long established axis between London finance and Johannesburg was sort of operational running of the mines. I mean, the money came from London, the loans came from London, and in effect, a lot of the profits come back to London. And that was the context in which Lonmin was set up. But we now have a new context, which is the headquarters themselves operationally are based in London. Okay, so the reason they do that is that they can have operations in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, and so on. And so the continuing nexus that Lonmin was an early sort of representative of is actually typical of a new situation. So Lonmin is 51% owned by, it's got 51% on the London Stock Exchange and 49% in Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And amongst its shareholders through London now are Extractive, which is an Anglo-Swiss corporation, later taken over by Glencore, 25%. Another company called Old Mutual, which was a South African insurance company, but moved to the UK, and Prudential. So what you have again is the actual operational control is in South Africa, but the money is ending up in Britain. And there's just one last thing about the money side, which I should add, which is very good research by a colleague, a friend of mine, Dick Forsland, who is with the Alternative Information Centre in Cape Town. But what he did is he looked at this claim Lonmin had that it couldn't afford to pay the workers a living wage. What he did is he said, well, let's have a look at how much profits you're making or say you're making and how much profits you actually should be making on the basis of all the other data which you've got about the company. And what he discovered is that they were hiding loads of profits. There was like literally a Bermuda Triangle where the profits got lost. And the company has these internal mechanisms where, I mean, I think there are two. One is it has a holding company between the HQ in London and the operating company, which charges for lots of services supplied. And so the operating company loses profits that way. And the other way it did it is that it has an arm which supposedly sells the platinum. And this arm was based in Bermuda and was taking massive sales commissions. So it looked as though the operation was not making any money or hardly any money. And all the profits were in a non-taxable tax haven, Bermuda. And so Forsland's research exposed all this. And it was pretty clear that they could afford to pay the workers significantly more, but they were scooping the profits away. I mean, we can talk a bit more about the global structure of mining for sure, but I mean, this was a pivotal change in the late 1990s, which, if you like, is a globalization of apartheid. I mean, that's it's sort of a globalization of neocolonialism, really, because now what you've got is of the top 5 mining corporations in the world, 3 or 4 of them, depending on how you measure it, are either based in London or they've got a very strong London connection. And 2 of those 4 came directly from South Africa to London. So yeah, it's huge. I mean, structurally, it's a massive issue because London continues to be, and I'm talking about the City of London and all the investors put their money through London asset management companies and banks, a major financier and a major beneficiary of mining extractivism all over the world. And so when it comes, for example, well, maybe we'll come on to it later. I'll leave it there for now.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful to tie it into this broader global picture of what's been happening in the most recent shift in period. But I want to transition now a little bit and ask if you could tell us what you're able to about how the Marikana Massacre has impacted the people in the region of Marikana and the local organizing initiatives that have emerged since the massacre. Like, as you said, the strike continued on and other things that have happened since then.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the whole logic of the fight against apartheid was to find unity in the struggle. Because if you wanted to end apartheid, then let's concentrate on that. Let's get one person, one vote. Let's get rid of white minority rule. But in actual fact, and this became clearer during the end game in the 1990s, and it's certainly become clearer since, there were different visions about what comes after apartheid. Okay. And so, I mean, it was a liberation struggle, but there was also a class differentiation between those who basically wanted to replace whites, but not really change the economic structures very much. And so they would become, in a sense, the new whites, right? And those who saw the ending of apartheid as a necessary component of liberation in a much broader sense. And the key distinction here in terms of economic policy was to do with the mining corporations and the big banks, basically. I mean, the central part of the economy, but kept in the hands that it had been for nearly 100 years. So there wasn't much structural economic change, which meant that the room for maneuver, and that was accepted, that was a deal. The deal was made between the ANC and the Western powers and the representatives of the white minority, that there would be a transition and it would be a peaceful transition. But the condition of that would be, don't touch our wealth, don't touch the sources of our wealth. And that was a deal that was consciously entered into by both sides. Now, where does that leave the black majority, who are poor, who have very little work, who are super exploited, have very low wages? Well, there were some gains after the ending of apartheid. I don't want to say that there weren't, because there were. I mean, there were some houses were built, 1 million new homes were built. There has been a raising up of a section of the black population. And what you effectively had is the white privilege is no longer just white privilege. There's a degree of class privilege. There has been some black empowerment. However, the majority of Africans in South Africa are still horribly poor, horribly exploited, horribly excluded from the mainstream of the economy. And that, you know, they are excluded, marginalized, having fought a liberation struggle. This is what they end up with. And that really is crystallized in Marikana. What were they fighting for but to be shot down when they demand a living wage, when they seek a living wage, and to only to be shot down? What was it all for? And so this was a real turning point in the post-apartheid politics of South Africa, because you're talking from 1994, when Nelson Mandela was first president of South Africa, to 2012, 18 years, and there's a generation. And so there's new concerns. I mean, the struggle now is a class struggle. It's a class struggle between the rich, which is a sort of an alliance of the pre-existing alliance between the white minority and the big corporations, many of them international. And now you do have a new black bourgeoisie, who Ramaphosa completely exemplifies. So this is a neo-colonial situation, where you have an alliance between those who benefited from the deal. I mean, some of them, Ramaphosa was made a billionaire. He was actually made a billionaire by the goodwill of big corporations. Like, he got the McDonald's franchise. He was gifted all these franchises in order to build him up. He's a creation of the corporations, right? But he's black, he's African. He played a very good role in the liberation struggle. He was a leader of the Mine Workers Union, right? So he fulfills both functions. He both has a genuine claim to be representative of the struggle on the one hand. On the other hand, he's completely bought and paid for by the corporations, right? So he fits both roles, right? And that's exactly the process which Marikana brought out into the open. Structurally, very little has changed. If you go to Marikana today, you'll see dirt shacks. You'll see people who don't have enough money to build their own house. You'll see that there's no running water. You'll see land which is choking people with dust when it doesn't rain. And when it rains, you can't walk because the dirt tracks are clogged and they're full of shit, to be frank, and so on. So it is a really horrible place for people to live. I mean, physically, of course, there are community, sisterhood and brotherhood. Now we do come on to the sort of the social movement's response to it. And I've already mentioned the trade union issue. So the mine workers shifted their allegiance from the NUM, the NUM, to a growing union, which started in the coal mines, actually, and extended its influence into the gold and platinum belt, and that's AMCU. And so AMCU becomes the majority union in the Lonmin plant. Okay, so AMCU is now much more of a representative voice of the mine workers, but it's not the only voice. I mean, I've visited AMCU and I recognize that they have this strong affiliation. There are other voices, and they are the reflections of the experience, in particular within the communities as grassroots women's organizations. We work with Sine Tembu, which is a grassroots women's organization. There's very legitimate support from the church organizations and human rights organizations, in particular defending the legal claims of the victims of the, not only, I mean, there's loads of different categories of victim of the massacre who are still fighting, some of them, for legal compensation. There's an overall fight, by the way, for justice. No police has ever gone to prison for the massacre. There are, I think, 2 trials still going ahead. One has already been shelved, but there is one trial still going ahead, but it's going to take years. We're now 9 years after the massacre, and they're still talking about it will take at least 2 more years to complete this trial, right? So the wheels of justice are certainly been heavily delayed, and there's very little hope, really, that they will deliver justice, even if it is delayed. And the other sort of question here about how the state responded was what's known as the Farland Commission. So Farland Commission sat and took a load of evidence. I've already mentioned some of it. It's on the web, and I do recommend people to look for it, right? SERI, the South African Economic Institute, has got all the documents, all the evidence on the web, right? And it's incredible what you learn about what the police did, right? But what Farland himself did, the chair of the commission, is he always kept things within a certain limit. He shielded to a large extent the company from criticism, and he shielded Ramaphosa and the ANC politicians from direct challenge. He intervened to protect them. And so what you have is a sort of a partial criticism of the police and a very partial criticism of the company, and an almost complete exoneration of, lo and behold, the government who set up the commission, the ANC, right? And so Farland was literally a whitewash of the massacre. And so I think that there's still an awful lot of continued social injustice with the inequalities, and an awful lot of lack of justice from the state authorities. So, you know, it's an open and unhealed wound, I have to say.
Absolutely. And just to follow up on this, we will come to this a little bit also when we talk about the solidarity efforts, but there has been initiatives from the people there, the victims' families in Marikana, organizing for fundraisers and things like this, coming out of the wake of the massacre. Could you say a bit about this?
I mean, there are levels to this. I think it's quite a complex picture. I don't want to pretend otherwise. I mean, the first initiative was they didn't manage to break the strike. And that's probably the main thing. I mean, the miners fought on and they continue to fight. And their union, AMCU, is militant. I mean, they're not unrealistic, but they are fighting for the best that they can. I mean, they have a tough gig, I have to say, because the company Lonmin was almost bankrupt at one point and was sold on to Sibanye-Stillwater, which has taken over the last 2 years, the corporation. Sibanye looked like it was going to asset strip Lonmin. It looked like it was going to just go for the refinery and get rid of about 10,000 workers. In the event, they haven't done. And that's because actually the platinum sector has gone through an upturn. I mean, they actually talk about the platinum group of minerals. It's not only platinum, it's palladium, it's rhodium. I mean, they're all quite similar, but they all have, you know, they are similar in their chemical properties. And it so happens that rhodium is now fantastically profitable. I mean, it's like 15 times per ounce more than gold. And so the car companies are begging for this stuff because they use it in exhaust catalytic converters and what have you. So what it means in any case is that the profitability of the operation wasn't just the refinery, it was the whole mine. So the Sibanye-Stillwater have not I think they got rid of about 2,000 workers. They did cut down the workforce, but there are still 22,000 mine workers on the books of Marikana under Sibanye-Stillwater. So this is, a huge continuing trade union struggle, if you like. In terms of the widows, they have had to continue fighting. One of the things that Lonmin said, and which Sibanye-Stillwater have implemented, is that any murdered mine worker, there would be a member of the family which could have a post in the mine. But I mean, this you're talking about. I mean, what Joseph Mutunjua reported just last week was that 4 of the widows were working cleaning men's toilets. That was the job that they got. And if they refused to do that, then they would be sent underground to work in the mine. And this, this is a tough gig. I mean, women working under the mine, they're subject to a lot of, to be frank, gendered challenges, right? It's very tough working in the mine. It's not like the machines do everything. It's cheap labor force, and it's extremely physical as well as being extremely skilled, as far as you can see, right? I mean, the rock drill operators are hugely skilled workers who are extremely physical in their job at the same time. So it would be an extremely demanding environment to work in. So it's a bit of an empty promise, really, or it's even worse than that. Now, there are other struggles going on. I mean, there are struggles in the communities for just the basics of survival. There are big legal struggles. I mentioned this and I just expand on it a little bit. Again, just last week, Dalian Polfo was one of the advocates of the mine workers who's done a very good job in representing them at the Farland Tribunal, for example. He points out that there are 3 categories. So you have the immediate families and their their wives, the widows, and their loved ones. They've received some compensation, but they actually, what they've received compensation for is literally loss of earnings. They've never received any compensation for the trauma that they've been through and the sort of the wider injustice of what happened. So they are fighting for further compensation. You have another section which are nearly 400 mine workers were arrested. At one stage, the South African state was saying that they had killed their own brothers as some sort of conspiracy. I mean, the most weird concoction. But what you had was 350, 370 mine workers were imprisoned by the state immediately after the massacre. And they have got compensation. It's not that much per person, but when you add up so many people, that comes to 100 million rand, which is about £5 million over nearly 400 people. I worked it out the other day. I think it's about 15,000 pounds per head, right? Now the families, 35 families, they got a bit more, but it doesn't really. I mean, anyway, how can you compensate for taking somebody's life? I mean, it's just, you can't. And then there is a third category, which are loads of people injured, as well as the people being shot, dead. There are people with serious continuing, that they can't work, injuries. So yeah, there is a legal struggle going on, and that I could say, if you like, there's a political struggle. There are movements of opposition, the EFF, economic freedom fighters, supported the families of the victims, and there are grassroots initiatives, some of which are EFF, some of which are AMCU, some of which are independent, some of which I know are supported by the NGOs and the church. So there's an awful lot of communities in South Africa, as well as the one in Marikana, who are very badly affected by mining. And there is a kind of like a gendered code here, because what we're talking about, generally speaking, is the women in the communities that are most affected by the mining. And so there are networks of organizations, Women Against Mining, communities affected by mining. They have less profile. I mean, they're not sort of in the business of electorally presenting themselves, but in terms of real movements, they're, I think, very important.
And finally, I wanted to come to the international solidarity dimension. So last week, on the 16th of August, 2021, it was the 9th anniversary of the Marikana Massacre. And there was a solidarity demonstration here commemorating the massacre in London, organized in front of the South Africa House, which you played a role in organizing and speaking at, which was convened by the Marikana Solidarity Collective and sponsored by a number of international organizations, including the London Mining Network, Pan-African Social Community Forum, Women of Color Global Women's Strike, Caribbean Labor Solidarity. I think that this, even on its own, and how international the demonstration was, which maybe you can speak to, shows how this event and the Marikana Massacre and the structures surrounding it and responsible for it, which you've been speaking about, really resonate globally with peoples. So if you can talk a little bit about these international solidarity efforts, how they've emerged in support of the victims of the Marikana Massacre and the struggles in Marikana and South Africa, and in this context, tell us a bit about the demonstration from last week.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to. I mean, the massacre was televised. It was on TV screens worldwide. And almost as soon as it happened, people were getting onto Google and looking up, you know, what can be done here. And it turns out that Lonmin's headquarters at the time were just opposite Buckingham Palace. They were right near Hyde Park Corner. I think it was number 2 Hyde Park or something like that. And I mean, I went there, and so did other people. People just went there to protest at the headquarters. And I think there were about, you know, 30 or 40 people there. And that was the day of the massacre. And then we marched from there to South Africa House. So, you know, immediate response. They also, within the Black community of London, African, descendant Afro-Caribbean and African community, people responded. And what they did, and it was in particular Brother Tongagara, who's still with us, but is, you know, quite of advanced age, and a friend of mine, Cecil Gutsmore, started doing pickets of the South African embassy. And really, they were the ones who made sure that there was a continuing solidarity from the Black communities in London. And I was very pleased. I didn't know about this at first, and I was very pleased to hear about it. And I joined with them. And so we together have organised the annual commemorations. And yeah, every year we want to make sure that people don't forget. And some years we've also done protests at the investment houses, which you know, are also located in London. I mean, when the mining companies came here, there was also these sort of other financial houses also came here, right? So I've already mentioned one, which is Old Mutual, the insurance one, but there's another one called Investec. Now you'll see posters from Investec all over the tubes in London. I mean, they sponsor opera, they sponsor horse racing, I think they sponsor hockey. I mean, they sponsor the pastimes of the upper middle class and the British establishment. So they are projecting themselves into British society for people of high net worth. I actually tried to get onto an email with them, and they said, you know, you actually need £60,000 income a year and not before we'll answer your email. So I didn't qualify for that. Okay, so I mean, they have not one office, they have several offices in central London. So we've been to protest there. I mean, we want to bring the thing to central London, right? And so if you like, this has been, I mean, we're not massive. I mean, the groups that you mentioned, it is an array of different groups, but I mean, we are sort of groups of activists. I don't want to big it up bigger than it is, you know. We're talking about dozens of people rather than thousands of people have been involved in these protests. So it is worthwhile doing, it is something, but it's not yet a mass movement. But we've kept this alive, we've kept the memory and the challenge to the British establishment and its responsibility alive. Now, there is a connection to this with what's happening now with the movement against climate change, destruction of the planet, which everybody is so aware of because it's so much part of our lived experience now. And, you know, we have been collaborating with Extinction Rebellion. We were pleased to be part of the takeover of Brixton a couple of weeks ago. And we will be pleased to be part of the, hopefully, a bigger takeover of London, which is, I think, already happening as we speak. And I think the connection of people concerned about the climate and the environment and what we've been doing in relation to the British multinational corporations destroying the lives of people of colour in the global south is really important. I mean, it's fundamental. We have to make this connection. I mean, the truth is that if you look at it, you can look at it both in terms of structure and in terms of agency, the classic sort of social science dichotomy. In terms of structure, Britain is a major contributor to the destruction of the planet. If you look at the amount of greenhouse gas emissions produced in Britain, it's only about 1/6 or 1/7 of the greenhouse gases that British companies abroad actually generate. So I'm talking about the big oil companies, BP and Shell, and these three big mining corporations, RTZ, Anglo-American, and BHP Billiton, plus Glencore. So you've got a couple of halves there, right? Okay. What they do is they operate all over the world. And these companies operate in 70, 80, 90 countries around the world, generating the materials, the coal, the oil, the gas, which is destroying the planet. So the actual emissions don't take place here, but the money ends up here, right? So this is like environmental imperialism. This is ecological imperialism. So the environmental movement has to completely destroy the argument of actually all the main political parties, I have to say, that Britain is a leader in fighting climate change. It's an absolute and complete lie. It can only be sustained if you don't take into account the imperialist character of British multinational corporations. And as soon as you recognize this character, then you have to say Britain is actually one of the worst offenders in the world. It's probably responsible for 7 or 8 times more greenhouse gas emissions than are actually taking place inside Britain itself. Okay, so structurally, this is super important. And in terms of agency, I can only welcome and embrace Extinction Rebellion taking on Shell. I mean, we have to bring this fight to the corporates. And I see a very good article by George Monbiot in The Guardian just this week. I mean, there is no way we can stop climate change, climate disaster actually, without breaking the power of fossil fuel corporations. We actually have to destroy them. And I don't mean them as people, I mean them as organizations. We have to destroy them because there is no other way to stop polluting the planet. They will make a profit from fossil fuels. It's not true that oil price will collapse and so on. I mean, oil price will allow them to continue making profit for decades to come. So we cannot leave it to their goodwill. Where there's a profit, they'll go for it, right? We actually have to break them and make sure that it's not profit that decides this. If it's left to profit, then it's going to destroy the planet. So this is a huge challenge for us. And we're actually in a quite important position here in Britain, in London for sure, but more broadly in Britain with the COP26 in Glasgow. We should do everything we can to support communities all over the world that are fighting from a community perspective and a worker perspective, very often these big fossil fuel corporations. But even over and above that, in taking the general interest into account, we should not only support those communities, we need to put on the agenda the complete breakup of these corporations.
Absolutely. And it's our, we have a special responsibility to play a certain role in that, because we're based here in Britain, in Europe, in North America, where these companies are based, have their headquarters. There's an onus on us to take up that challenge too. Yeah. Exactly so.
Exactly so. And there's also, I mean, it's a weird thing about being in Britain, right? Because all around the world, communities are fighting these corporations, right? Yeah. Now, on the particularities of their suffering, of their exploitation, right? We are in a position, just because we happen to be here and they have a general global coverage, we have to look at their general global coverage. Yeah. And that's what we have to confront. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure people all over the world can understand that, can be part of that and lead that struggle in every respect, right? But we have absolutely, I completely agree with you, we have a special responsibility in this respect.
Absolutely. Well, I think, unfortunately, of course, there's much more we could continue talking about, but I think that we've run out of time for this segment. Is there any final thoughts you would like to leave us with before we close?
We do remember Marikana. We remember Mambush, the man in the green blanket. We remember all the other mine workers who were assassinated in that strike. And we will not let their memory go. We will be back there next year. Everybody who sees this broadcast, please tell your friends and whoever you think might be interested. 16th of August, the date does not change. In late afternoon, we will be outside the South African Embassy on the east side of Trafalgar Square in 2022, which will be the 10th anniversary. Right at the beginning, you mentioned the different organizations who we collaborate with, and we're very pleased to work with them. We're hoping that more organizations will, we want to make the 10th anniversary a really big event worthy of the memory of the mine workers. And yeah, secondly, I guess I should say, if you want to read up on this, there is a very good film, which is Miners Shot Down. I think it's now on YouTube. There are two very good books. One is by Greg Mironovich and one is by Peter Alexander, both of which Peter Alexander really rebuts, and his co-authors, they really rebut the lies which were immediately put out by the South African government. And Greg's book is a bit fuller, more complete, and he really begins to explain this sort of neo-colonial context. And you can also look up my name, and I've written a sort of an introductory article about what happened and the cover-up of it. So there are other materials available, and we want to continue the discussion, and we also would in particular invite all our environmentalist friends who have been animated and involved in Extinction Rebellion to really make a difference in terms of this thing of challenging, and hopefully we need to destroy the power of these multinational corporations. I just wanted to add one more point, which is about the fundraising appeal, which we launched on Monday the 16th, and that is for Sinitemba, which is Khoza for We Have Hope. And Sinitemba is a grassroots women's organization in the communities, the mining communities of Marikana. What they do is extremely in the community grassroots work. So they have workshops where women work together and do consciousness raising. They create handicrafts, which they sell to get a bit of income. They're also involved in opposing within the community gendered violence against women. And they've also, some of the sisters who have set up Sinitemba were very involved in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, where they were protesting. I mean, in actual fact, one of the women who were protesting was shot at that time as well. And so what you have is an invisible part of this story, which is actually extremely important and extremely marginalized and extremely lacking in resources. As in many parts of the global south, under COVID, things have got drastically worse for people living off the land, not access to agriculture, and without any state support whatsoever. I mean, this is extremely serious because basically whether they even get basic food from with no support, and you can't go out, you can't do things in the marketplace, which you might have been trying to do before. So we are very happy to support Sinitemba, and we will put in a link, a GoFundMe link with the resources. And if you can spare £20 or whatever it might be, we would be very happy to accept it, and there could not be a more worthwhile recipient of your support and your donation. So please think about, what we can do. We don't need to wait till next year. You can do something now if you don't mind. We'd be very grateful.
Absolutely. And all of the resources that you mentioned, we will provide links down below and published alongside this video that people can find those resources collected together in one place. Thank you so much, Andy, for speaking with us. It was a pleasure.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.